Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 16. Inside an ePub.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
In today's episode, I'm going to give you a more technical show than usual. One of the things that I've never really explored that much myself, and I've been exploring in the background the last few weeks when I've been doing interview shows and slightly shorter shows, is how to do all these fancy effects and things that you see in a lot of ebooks. Things like drop caps, where you have a much larger capital letter at the start of a piece of text, or how you put text flowing around pictures in an ePub file. As a reminder, an ePub file is the standard format for electronic documents. Ironically, it's not the one that's used by Amazon. They use a format called .mobi files, or a newer format called .kf8. However, these aren't as easy to look into as an ePub file. And generally speaking, it's easy to convert an ePub into a Mobi file using the Kindle Gen program. And it's a lot more reliable conversion than converting a Word document, which is what a lot of authors do. So my file of choice for an electronic book format is the ePub file. This is the one used by stores such as Apple, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and in fact virtually everybody apart from Amazon. And as I say, it's relatively easy to convert an ePub file into a Mobi file using the tools that Amazon provides. The KF8 format is more similar to an ePub format than it is to a Word document. So the conversion process will more faithfully reproduce what the ePub looked like than a Word document. You may not find today's show particularly useful yourself if you pay somebody else to do formatting for you. However, I think it's useful to know how much or how little work is actually involved in doing something, so you can judge when people are trying to charge you for it, whether it's actually a big or a small job. And also gives you an idea of what's possible and what's time consuming. In today's show, I taught you through my own process of what I do to an ePub file after it's been produced by the Scrivener application. Your ePub file could just as easily be one produced out the back of Draft2Digital. If you submitted a Word document, you can then download the ePub that they produce from that and edit that in the same way as you could from a Scrivener document. Today's show is also limited to PC users, though I'm sure the actual same procedure could be used for a Mac. There are a whole number of programs which I haven't really tried using, such as Calibre and Juta and the like, which allow you to edit or amend ePub files without doing it in quite such a manual way as I suggest here. The reason why I started manually editing ePub files is because I wanted to know on a low level what exactly they were like. Electronic documents such as ePubs and Mobi files are a very different format to, say, a PDF. On a PDF, it's predisposed that you have page sizes that are always the same. Now, you can scale things up and down a bit, but generally speaking, it does assume that you've got a page size around the same sort of dimensions and size, at least relative height and width. For an ePub or other electronic ebook format, you need to put up with the fact that it could be displayed on virtually any device, anywhere from an iPad to an old Kindle app to an Apple PC. There's all sorts of options for actually displaying it, and it needs to be able to resize itself based on the size of the device you're using. So in its nature, it's much more like a web page than something like a PDF, which is designed for printing. People do tend to forget this, and you often see ePub files on devices such as iPads where they've not been formatted before, not looking very good at all. If you try and read things on a phone device, then you'll see the same issue. In fact, it's especially prevalent if people are reading on a phone to see books with badly formed tables and other things that just do not look right in an ePub file. This is where somebody has created it, said, oh, it looks okay on the Kindle, and just left it. This is never a good idea. because you never know where your target audience is going to be reading your ebook. So you want to have some knowledge and some sort of decently produced ePub file or Mobi file based on an ePub file. So I think it's important to know the nitty-gritty of what an ePub is actually like. I've written a guide that tells you how to go about opening up and amending an ePub file on a PC. I include a link for how you can get this on the show notes at beginselfpublishing.com.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
So if you've managed to get a first draft ePub version of your book, say using a program like Scrivener, or you've downloaded it from Draft to Digital, how can you go about editing that file manually? First thing to appreciate is that ePub is really just a zip file. For those of you who aren't technical, a zip file is a collection of other files all shoved together in one big file. It's literally like taking a directory structure with various folders in it and then just crunching that or zipping it all up into one big file, which you then send off to other people. Now, if you go into Windows Explorer and click on an ePub file, it's not going to open up as a zip file. However, if you just copy the file and then rename it as a .zip file, you can then open it up in Windows Explorer as if it was a zip file. You'll see that it's got two directories, meta, inf, and OPS, and also a file called MIME-type at the top level. The MIME-type file is a special file that tells the ePub standard that this is actually an ePub file. It's slightly peculiar standard, the ePub one. It's all agreed by committee. And frankly, I think they could have made it a lot more simple than what it is. Most of the stuff in the meta-inf directory you can ignore. Most of the action happens in the OPS directory. I would extract all the files from your renamed .zip file and create an actual directory on your disk with those files in it. The meta-inf directory contains just one file called container.xml, which tells the e-reader lots of information about the ePub file. Generally, we won't want to be touching that at all. The OPS directory is where all the actual content of the ebook is, the images, the chapters, and information about the table of contents. If you look inside the OPS directory, you'll see a lot of files. There are also two directories, usually, CSS and images. CSS contains what are called cascading style sheets. These are a web-based format of way of telling the ebook how to format particular items in your content files. The images folder usually contains images that are inside the ebook. Then at this level there should be a whole series of what are called XHTML files. These are the actual contents of your book in terms of the words, say all the chapters. Depending on what you've used to produce the ePub file, these could have a whole range of names. Scrivener produces a series with body 1, body 2, .xhtml, as goes on. These are the raw text of your ebook. Generally, the idea is that in the CSS directory, there are a whole load of CSS files which tell the e-reader how to process and show and format the text in the body.xhtml files. XHTML is similar but not identical to HTML. This is a slightly modified, more clean version of HTML. HTML is the format that's used on most web pages. For those of you who aren't familiar with what HTML is like on the web, rather than just a whole load of text, you've got text in between what are called tags. These are little pieces of text within angled brackets. You usually have opening and closing tags. So you'll have a angled bracket, then a piece of text, and then a closed bracket. Then you'll have some text after that. Then you'll have another angled bracket, usually some sort of slash symbol. Then the same text name as the starting tag, and then another angled bracket. The reason why HTML and XHTML have tags is it allows for particular sections of the text to be given a format by the cascading style sheets. Also allows you to lay out your document and have particular sections which are represented by tags. In the old days of HTML, they used to actually explicitly represent formats like bold. So if you put your text between the B tags, it came out as bold. This is now being discouraged, and people are moving towards using these other files called cascading style sheets, which are referenced by the HTML document to tell it how to format the particular document. In this way, you can change the cascading style sheet and change how your document looks without having to change the actual HTML content files. There are many tutorials about this online if you're interested in this subject matter.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
The XHTML format insists that everything must have opening and closing tags, which is slightly different from the HTML format you see on the web. You don't really necessarily need to worry too much about this particular format for many of the simple formatting and other changes you might want to do. For most intents and purposes, you can consider these XHTML files to be the same as HTML files, certainly in terms of looking up answers on the net. There is a special file called content.opf in this directory, which tells the ePub readers about all of the files in this ePub folder, and also gives information about who the author is, the description of the book, which image is the cover image, and also where and if there is a table of contents for the book. You want to be careful when you're editing in this file and always take a backup of it. Screwing up this file is a great way to make sure your book doesn't look correct. You may also find, depending on whether your file has a table of contents, a file toc.ncx and often a contents.xhtml file. Again, be careful editing these. To actually edit an ePub using the Windows Explorer, you would take the ePub file, rename it as a .zip file, select the zip file you created, and with the right mouse button, select Extract All. This will create a directory with the same name as that zip file. You then make changes to the files in that directory, for example, to add formatting effects or to remove or move where the table of contents is in the document. Once you've finished editing your files, what you need to do is select the MIME type file from inside the directory and then right mouse click it and select Send to Compressed Zip Folder. This might strike you as odd as to why you're just zipping up MIME type. The reason for this is that the ePub format, to be accepted by stores like Apple, has a particular ordering in terms of how you add files into the folder. The MIME type file needs to be the first file added in. So the way that I do this is I just zip up the MIME type file on its own and then add the other two directories, the meta-inf, the OPS, into that MIME type file. This creates a mimetype.zip file, which you then can drag the two meta-inf and OPS files into. Once you've done this, you can rename the mimetype.zip file into whatever .epub file name you want. So if your book's called ePub Design, it will be epubdesign.epub. You can then try this out by using a program such as Adobe Digital Editions and checking that the effects you want look correct in the document. If you're planning to release this to a store such as Apple or Barnes & Noble, then you might want to go to the validator.idpf.org site and test out that it considers it a valid ePub file. If your file does not pass this validation, then it's unlikely that Apple or Barnes & Noble will accept it. However, if you're just looking to release your book onto Amazon, the Kindle Gen program doesn't care whether the file's a valid ePub file or not, as long as it looks correct. So if you're just looking to release a book to the Kindle store, or to send to people directly with an ePub, most of the ePub readers don't actually do this validation check, it's just the stores. However, if there is an issue that comes up, this is often a sign that there is a problem, a bigger problem with the ePub file. So be careful if you are ignoring the validation results. It's not the most helpful site in the world, the ePub validator, but it will help you to get ePub that actually can be released to the other stores such as Apple without getting lots of problems with having to reformat your documents. So what sort of changes can you do to an ePub if you're editing it directly? Often it's simple things such as wanting to change the particular HTML links that one part of the document points to. So if you've got a version for the Apple Store, then you probably want to send any website links back to either a different web page or use something like UTM tracking codes to tell you that actually people visiting your site came from the Apple book and not from, say, like the Kindle app. You could just produce multiple versions from Scrivener to do this, or you could just take the ePub and just amend it. Probably slightly quicker to use, just amend the ePub files and then generate ones off it. But for just that, it's probably not worth the effort. But things like drop caps, and I'll provide in my guide an instruction on how to change the ePub file to do this, can only really be done by using this or some other ePub editing tool. One other common scenario, being able to change the way that text flows around images in your document. In general, if you insert an image into something like Scrivener, produce an ePub file out of it, text won't wrap around it. So you can't have this embedded image look on an ePub like you could, say, on a Word document. It's relatively easy to make changes to the ePub document to add in changes to the CSS so that for particular images the text will wrap around it either to the right or to the left. This can produce quite nice looking ePub documents. In terms of effects like drop caps, there are two ways to do this. You can either find an very small image of a letter you're looking for each drop cap. So for example, if you want a big letter A at the beginning of chapter 1, then you can look around the web for an appropriately large picture of an A and include that, and then amend the code so that it's wrapping around the text around it in a similar way to what I described in the last situation. The alternative is to actually change the CSS so that it has the option for a larger font size. Unfortunately, this is not as straightforward as it should be. Unfortunately, for a standard XHTML document, this doesn't work the way you would expect. If you just make one letter 2 times bigger, the bottom of that letter will be the same as the bottom of the next letter. And that's not the usual way that drop caps are displayed in books. So a much more fancy change to a CSS document is required to actually push down where that first letter starts and let the text wrap around it. This does kind of force you to have to use different sizes for different text, different pieces of text. They will scale correctly, but what those ratios are for each different font changes each time, which is quite annoying, to be honest. But this is one way to create fairly easy looking drop caps without having to go around finding multiple images for every letter in your book and just inserting them in. I've included in my guide an example for one particular Georgian font, which looks fairly good when it's resized. You can actually find with many of these things that people use similar stuff on their web pages. Unfortunately, not everything that works on a web page will work in an ePub document. There's a certain amount of experimentation required here to find that your drop cap won't actually work correctly on your ePub. Another situation where you might want to have to add special effects into a document that can't be done by something like Scrivener is where you want to include things like code snippets. Now, the issue with code snippets is that you don't want it to be formatted in the same normal font. You want it in a typewriter style font that doesn't word wrap. Nothing worse than a piece of code where the actual text wraps around. Now, ideally, you wouldn't have the ends of the lines cut off, but it's better on a smaller document to have people having to scroll across than having word wrap. So you've got some long piece of HTML or something like this, and then somebody looks at it and they're wondering what the hell's going on. Depending on your ability with HTML and learning CSS, there are many things that are actually possible. There are 2 separate ePub standards. There's the ePub 2 standard, which most e-retailers use, and then there's ePub 3, A lot of the retailers will actually accept some of the features of ePub 3. For example, there's something called media queries, which is not actually part of the ePub 2 standard, but I believe both Amazon and Apple accept. Media queries let you change how your book is formatted depending on the size of the device it looks at. It can be very useful when you've got an ePub on a phone as opposed to a large 40-inch tablet or something along those lines. And in this world that we're living in, it's more and more people are doing strange things like reading books on their television. There's a whole slew of devices, from small, thin mobile devices to tablets, to e-readers, even up to televisions, where people could potentially read ePub documents. So media queries and things like that can be very helpful in the long term. Some of the newer formats, like the KF8 format, which I haven't yet had a chance to play with, can do things like support embedded video. I also believe ePub 3 can probably do this as well. The only book I've read so far that had embedded video in it is Gary Vaynerchuk's Crush It book. I'm not sure he's made that much use of it, but after each chapter heading, he has a little 2 or 3 minute video. These kind of things are never going to be able to be played on a static, old-fashioned black and white Kindle device though. But you can read them on iPhones, iPads, and the newer Amazon Fire devices. So you might want to consider at some time looking into this. I'll try and look into this in a future episode, because you know I like doing all sorts of weird technical things, and creating a video book might be an interesting experiment. If you go to beginselfpublishing.com/epub guide, you'll find a link where you can get hold of a free guide to tell you how to actually do the manual changes required to add some of these effects in. As time goes on, I may update the document. I'll let you know about that. That's about it for this week. I'm looking to get back into doing some more interview shows in the next few weeks to give me a bit more chance to work on things like this guide. Generally set up a proper self-publishing guide at beginselfpublishing.com. Talk to you guys next week. The day that this is released is International Podcast Day. In honour of International Podcast Day, I would ask you to tell somebody you know who hasn't heard about podcasts and just explain to them what a podcast is. You can tell them about my show or tell them about another show that you like or listen to. It still amazes me in this day and age that there are lots and lots of people who have never heard of podcasts and they're really missing out. Please use the day as an opportunity to tell somebody you know about podcasts and introduce them to this great way of learning about new things for free.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.